And God had seen that. God had known that this was building and decided to use that to teach him and ultimately teach us the danger of something like that. But before we dig even deeper into that, I want to go ahead and finish this passage and see how it ends, because it doesn't end on such a terrible note, as dramatic as this event is. Verse 34. But at the end of the period, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my reason returned to me, and I blessed the Most High and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation, and all the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing. But he does according to his will in the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and no one can ward off his hand or say to him, "What hast thou done?" At that time my reason returned to me, and my majesty and splendor were restored to me for the glory of my kingdom, and my counselors and my nobles began seeking me out. So I was reestablished in my sovereignty, and surpassing greatness was added to me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise, exalt, and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are true and his ways just, and he is able to humble those who walk in pride. That's an amazing ending. I'm encouraged by a lot of things, and as much as we've dug into this at this point, now that we have the whole story, I want to start extrapolating some things that I believe God intended us to learn from this particular passage. And we see the king immediately acknowledging God as king. That brings him out of this. And that little bit of hope that was there, his kingdom was fully restored, his mind was fully restored, and God brought him back. There are several ways he could have responded to this. Again, we don't know if ultimately him not coming to this conclusion, if that would have definitely kept him in this state and he would have never come out of it. We do know that God allowed him that, whether earlier or ultimately allowed him to change his ways and acknowledge God as the true king. But I think of it interestingly that we all go through periods of time, and we can choose to blame God or acknowledge something as part of his plan. And King Nebuchadnezzar could have just as easily been bitter about this whole scenario. He could have just as easily turned his back on God and said, "Why would I follow a God or acknowledge a God that would do something like this?" Have you ever heard somebody say that? I hear it all the time. I personally can have those struggles where God puts me through something or I'm going through something and you want to just blame God. It's all his fault. Why would I trust him? But King Nebuchadnezzar ultimately came back from that and not only was able to see that God is in charge, but acknowledged that his plan is great and he wants to be part of that. Psalm 119:75, you don't have to turn there, but I felt that this was an appropriate verse to go along with what he was seeing. Psalm 119:75. I know, O Lord, that your judgments are righteous, and that in faithfulness you have afflicted me. So there are a lot of lessons we can learn from this. One of them we've started to talk about, and that's the one that I think many people will key in on, and that's the takeaway. Pride. Pride is bad. Pride cometh before the fall. But there's more going on in this story, and I don't think that Nebuchadnezzar wanted to tell his entire kingdom this message as humiliating as a story as this is for him to tell to those that are under him. He felt it important to get this message out. And I don't believe he did that just to show how dangerous pride is. I think there's a much bigger message out of this, and that's God is in control. But I also don't want to end with that, because that has another side to it. We can say God is in control, God is sovereign, he's in charge. We can say that until we're blue in the face. But that makes it sound like we don't have a responsibility. It makes it sound like we don't do anything. Like we just are supposed to go along with it and have a good attitude. And that's not how the Bible spells it out. The Bible does give us answers for that, and it does address the other side. And that's the idea of trust. Trust is ultimately what we are called to do. God is sovereign. God is in charge. How do we handle that? How do we answer that? We trust in him. So what does that look like? And what should we understand in there? Because trust in God, he knows better than our plans, but we don't always get to understand them. We don't always know what's happening. We don't know why it's happening. So one of the questions I want to ask as we start to wrap this up is, what is our trust in? Now, with King Nebuchadnezzar, it seems a bit more obvious. He had pride. He had a very, very large ego, and that was, for him, ultimately what pulled him away from trusting in God, because he had built such a great kingdom, and he had so much power. Why would he need to trust in anyone else but himself? But it's dangerous for us to make that the lesson, because you might not be dealing with pride, but you may be trusting in something else. A few other verses that go along with this, Psalm 9:10, and those who know your name will put their trust in you, for you, Lord, have abandoned those who seek you. Psalm 37, verses 4 and 5, delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. Commit your way to the Lord, trust also in him, and he will do it. So we're called to trust. We know King Nebuchadnezzar had a problem with pride, and that was where he fell into it. And maybe that is your problem. Maybe it's pride. But there are a lot of things that we put our trust in. And most of the time, they're things that we consider to be reliable. They're things that we consider to be dependable. But when push comes to shove, are they as solid as God's plan? Are they always there? A few things that I think we put our trust into could be people. Again, I referenced early on in talking about the Olympics, and many athletes, they're totally fine accepting that credit for their hard work. But others might share it, and they might be relying on a coach or a family member or a teammate. And similarly, as we go through our lives and we think about possible struggles that could happen, maybe we're going, oh, well, it won't be that bad because I have my parents, I can rely on them. Or it won't be that bad because I know that my friend's always going to be there to do this. And now our trust is in people. Can people fail? Absolutely. Does God use people in our lives? Absolutely. God has used countless people in my life, whether it be friends or family, and he's encouraged me, he's built me up, he's used them to grow. But if I start relying on them, and if that's who I'm trusting in, we're going to have a problem, because they can't live up to all my expectations, and they won't always be there. They're not God. Another area, it could be promises, agreements that you've made. Maybe it's a legal contract. Somebody told you they would do something. Great. Hopefully they will. Can those fail? Yes. Another part that I see, and this is something that God is showing me personally and that I've seen in our culture, is we will often rely on things like ownership or wealth. I have a possession, I have money, I'll be okay. I can have a contingency plan. If I have something that I can fall back on, whether it's my house or my money or some other piece of property that gives me security, maybe I'm putting my trust in that, and that's a danger. And one other thing that we, especially in our American culture, I love my country, by the way, is we have a tendency to put a lot of trust in our laws or maybe our rights. They're inalienable, right? We have inalienable rights. It says it right there. We've gone through many times that should make that obvious, that we can't fully trust in laws or rights. God supersedes those. Anything can happen. And as much as if you have the opportunity to stick up for something that's good, you should. If that's what you're leaning on, you're going to find yourself in a place where it's eventually going to fail you. because countries can fail, laws can fail. You may not always have those rights. And if any of those things go away, what's going to happen in your life? Because out of all the things we've talked about, there's one thing that's constant, and that's God. All these other things, we can't control them. We can't control them. Our choices make a big difference. And we can't control what's going to happen. But how does that fit in with God's plan? Because we just said we can't just sit back and expect everything to be wonderful if we're not trying. So what does that look like? Well, for King Nebuchadnezzar, he finally acknowledges that God is part of his kingdom and allowed it. And now, as he goes forward, he can still rule his kingdom. He can still do wonderful things for his people. But he's now acknowledging God as part of that process. So whatever happens, he can understand that God is in control, and he can accept that rather than it just completely puts you in a place where now you don't know what to do. And we've all been there. He was in a place where he thought he was in control and suddenly found out he wasn't. One of the most powerful, if not the most powerful person on the earth at that time, everything taken away from him. Maybe we're going through a year where everything looks great, and all of a sudden some random virus pops up. And a lot of things that we expected and understood are completely different. And I think it was evident in my own life that I was not fully acknowledging God as being in control, because there were so many pieces of my life that I had to see, oh, that's not something I can control. Oh, that's not something I can control. But if we see that we're ultimately trying to work with God's plan, when things change, we acknowledge that, we try and understand what God is doing, and we try and make choices that are in line with what he's trying to accomplish. Not everybody here is a soccer fan, but we're going to talk about soccer just a little bit. Just a little bit. And you can relate this to other sports. It doesn't have to be just soccer, but I do think about it in a way where you get out on a soccer field and you're part of a team, and generally you have a role, you have a position. Maybe you're the guy that's supposed to score the goals. You're the striker. Maybe you're a defender. Maybe you're the goalkeeper. You're the last one stopping it. So the goalkeeper seems like a really easy one to pick on here. That goalkeeper, he gets the ball. He makes a save. Yeah! Now he starts running up the field with it. Everyone's like, what's going on? You just kind of like watching, like, what are you doing? What are his chances of succeeding in that strategy? They're pretty small. Like, if he's an awesome goalkeeper playing against some pretty mediocre players, maybe he's going to run up there and score. Maybe. But chances are, he has a really small percentage of succeeding in that scenario. Now let's imagine in those same situations, he's making his decisions based on what the team understands and how the team was set up to work and what the coach has told them and how they've practiced, and those are how his decisions are based. All of a sudden, he has a much better chance at succeeding because he can make his own choices, but ultimately, he's not in control of the outcome. But if he participates based on what he understands of the plan, he's going to have a much better chance of succeeding. And so as we start to wrap this up, there are many things that we run into, and oftentimes we see God's sovereignty as conflicting with our freedom of choice. And I don't believe we truly understand what our freedom means, because if God's in control and we aren't in control, as we go throughout our life making our own choices, we can't control everything. I look back to the Olympics and those success stories. For all these people that maybe wouldn't have even been in these Olympics had not what happened last year happened, and these are wonderful success stories. It's like, wow, they almost didn't make it and they won a gold medal. For every one of those stories, there's someone sitting at home that didn't get to go. For all of these athletes that made it on the podium, there are dozens of stories likely throughout their life that could have prevented them from getting there, that would have been out of their control. Accidents avoided, people that came into their life that helped them. And there are just as many people on the other side that are sitting around, and if they're not trusting in God and acknowledging his plan, they're just frustrated. And I think as we finish up this story, there's several messages, but Nebuchadnezzar ultimately acknowledged God was in control, and he was able to have peace with that because now that governed how he lived. He wasn't angry and ultimately frustrated. And that's what we can do to ourselves. True peace for Nebuchadnezzar didn't come from faith in himself. It came in acknowledging and trusting God. And I think when we allow ourselves to make decisions and choices based on that sovereignty, that's when we're actually free. That's when we can live our lives without that constant frustration and getting angry at every situation that doesn't go our way. So that's my challenge to myself. That would be my challenge to you is remember as you go throughout your lives, we do have a responsibility. And we should be making our choices in line with what we believe God is trying to do in our lives and for others and what he's teaching us. And that is how we can actually live without that constant frustration, and we can be at peace with what's happening in the world today. Let's pray. Dear Lord, I do learn as we look through your word, there's so much to learn. And sometimes we think that there's one single message for us and there's one single message for everyone. And I hope that today as we look through Daniel and we look at this letter that King Nebuchadnezzar had sent out and that he felt it was important to share his testimony and his hardships, but ultimately acknowledge you as king, I ask that you would help us to remember that and to look for ways in our own lives where we can see that maybe we're trusting in something else and it's preventing us from having that joy and peace that you promise us. And I pray that you would help us to trust you, knowing that this is a day-to-day struggle and a day-to-day commitment. It's not something that we just say once or acknowledge once, but we have to work on it. And I ask that you would help us all with that. In Jesus' name, amen. All right.
Thank you, Andrew. You posed great questions to us this morning, like what are we putting our trust in and what are we relying upon? Makes us think, which is a good thing. So we're going to close with You Are My Hiding Place. It's number 700 in the hymnal. And I invite you to stand as we close out the service.
Trust in you.
join us for some fellowship time in the fellowship hall behind us. And I hope you have a really fun afternoon. Thank you.